सहेली चुन ले अपना कुइया सबको हूँ मैं लाती ओए सबको हूँ मैं लाती सहेली चुन ले अपना साथी ओ गोरी चुन ले ओए चुन ले अपना साथी सहेली चुन ले अपना साथी तुम्हार कोरे नौ गो मोरे राजर बला हो राजर बला तुम्हार कोरे नौ गो मोरे राजर बला हो राजर बला कोणिये देवो तुम्हारे ढकाई छड़ी हिरमला हो हिरमला तुम्हार कोरे नौ गो मोरे राजर बला हो राजर बला प्रेम नगर की रानी बनकर रहोगी हंसी गाती ओए रहोगी हंसी गाती सहेली चुन ले अपना साथी ओ गोरी चुन ले अपना साथी
Salam, Namaskar, good morning to our North American attendees. Good evening, Shubho Shondha to everyone joining from South Asia. This is Elora Chowdhury. As co-editor, I extend a warm welcome to our authors. This is the first time we are gathering as a full group, thanks to wonders of Zoom, that we joined from 7 different countries and with an international audience. It brings me immense pleasure to celebrate together in an otherwise bleak year, the publication of our volume, South Asian Filmscapes, Transregional Encounters. From viewing the slideshow, it would have been evident to everyone that work leading to this book spans multiple years, geographies, and alliances. The song you just heard is Saheli Chun Le Apna Sathi from a 1960 Urdu language Pakistani film called Saheli, or Beloved Friend, with lyrics in Bangla, Urdu, Pashto, and Punjabi. A border crossing film that embodies the spirit of the book, and we will hear more about it from Professor Kamran Asdar Ali in his presentation shortly. I'm reminded of the early years of the formation of the South Asian Regional Media Scholars Network, following Esha Niyogi Dey's Fulbright research on region-encompassing border-crossing cinema across South Asia. I myself was engaged in research about Bangladeshi women-centered and women-directed films about the Mukti Juddho, or Liberation War at the time, when the idea evolved to a series of cross-border conversations in South Asia itself on the topic of transregional filmscapes across historical periods, national, religious, and linguistic boundaries. Our efforts to forge regional connections have been both productive and turbulent. While at times thwarted by state politics, many among our contributors will remember the inaugural conference in 2015, which had been planned to take place on the campus of Dhaka University. Over 30 scholars across South Asia and beyond were to gather, but barely 2 weeks before the conference was set to start, the administration of Dhaka University declared a suspension of all academic exchange with Pakistan, thereby making it impossible for the Pakistani scholars from participating in the conference. Relations between the two countries had been rife with tension, most recently at the time around the Bangladesh War Crimes Tribunals. As a public university, the grounds of which are witness to the genocide in 1971, the university administration stressed that all intellectual relationships with Pakistan would be severed until the day Pakistan state issued an official apology to Bangladesh. And we will hear more about this history through the films of Zahir Raihan from Fahmida Akhtar shortly. Still, the network thrived, perhaps propelled all the more by the necessity and value of scholarly exchanges, and subsequent gatherings were held in Lums, Lahore in 2016 and in Jadavpur University, Kolkata in 2018. Albeit these events too were riddled with visa denials and travel restrictions, barring individuals from crossing national borders. The organizers are here today: Dr. Madhuja Mukherjee, who is a contributing author, Dr. Abhijit Roy from Jadavpur University, and Dr. Ali Khan from LUMS. These workshops instilled anew among participants the desire for continued explorations in trans-regional filmic encounters. Our physical and cinematic border crossings have reinforced both the realities of geopolitical policing by the nation states and hand in hand the gaps and erasures in mutual knowledge that come in the way of trusting alliance. We are moved by historian Aisha Jalal's observation, for instance, that partition is not just an event that occurred in 1947, as the founding myth of the post-colonial nation states of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. It is a way of seeing and being that separates what were once historically indivisible people. That being noted, cinema as a layered archive, as an imaginative modality, aspire in us a different frame to understand the vicissitudes coming down from historical events. In the words of Dina Siddiqui, for instance, the Liberation War of 1971 also displaced and reconstituted older meanings of partition by exposing the irresolution in the meaning of Pakistan and the question of Bengal's Muslims. And this question of identity and industry in cross-wing and independent cinema is taken up by Fahmidul Haq and Lotte Hoek, and you will be hearing from them too today. This need to reframe, rethink, and reckon with the divides within the subcontinent in a new era of regional and global hierarchies is demonstrated by the divergent experiences of traversing borders by members of our collective. There are numerous borders taken up by authors in the book, including chapters on Kashmir, representations of Sikhs in Hindi cinema, and the indigenous cinema of the Chittagong Hill Tracts, to name a few. The power and lasting impact of storytelling, narrative, critical engagements through cinematic imaginations we maintain cannot be overstated. Before I turn to my co-author, I personally want to thank a few people for making the book and today's event possible. Firstly, thank you to Esha for her generous, ethical, and intellectually vibrant leadership of the collective. All our contributors, we have learned so much from your work. And the audience today, including many friends of the project who have supported us along the way. Heartfelt thanks to Laren McLaughlin, our brilliant editor at the University of Washington Press, for supporting this project in all the stages. The wonderful design team, the publicity team, Kate Heacock in helping us organize today's event. Thank you to the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department, Asian Studies Department, and the Film Studies Program at UMass Boston, and also to the Dean's Office for the numerous travel and research grants that enabled travel to South Asia for research and for us to work with our wonderful research assistants, Shilpi Suneja, Riva Pearson, and Emma Stoskov-Ehrlich. All are in attendance today. We thank you for your meticulous work. And last but certainly not the least, my co-conspirator in almost everything, B. Downey, for running the show today. Endless gratitude to you and to all of you in attendance. So it is my pleasure now to turn it over to Esha Niyogi.
This is Esha Niyogi. As co-editor of South Asian Filmscapes, I want to extend my warm thanks to UCLA Center for India and South Asia for co-sponsoring this event, to Professor Akhil Gupta for his strong support, and to Jamaica Villegas, who is with us today, for her wonderful help. I'm truly honored and encouraged to have in our audience so many friends of our projects from so many places and so many parts of the world, different countries and South Asia, and Europe, and Australia, I think. Our collective is grateful to the American Institute of Pakistan Studies for their generous support of our Lahore conference in 2016, and especially to the then president of AIPS, Professor Kamran Asghar Ali, who joins us today as contributing author. I'm so very thankful for her perspicacious and enthusiastic guidance to Larry McLaughlin, our editor at University of Washington Press, and to the wonderful team who actually organized, as Elora just said, this event, led by Kate Heacock. My debt to Elora is immeasurable for her intellectual comradeship and her courageous vision, and courageous and non-compromising vision that has led us forward. To all the contributing authors and to my co-organizers of conferences in South Asia, Madhuja Mukherjee, Abhijit Roy, and Ali Khan, who all are joining us today, I say, your perspectives enabled us to co-imagine what transregional cinema could mean on South Asian grounds. Approaching films from multiple disciplinary perspectives, the chapters of South Asian Filmscapes illustrate that cinemas, constituting what Nasreen Rahman in this volume calls a multi-sensory archive, are potent for studying a border-riddled region such as South Asia, torn asunder by colonial and neo-colonial processes, yet imminently intertwined through shared languages, cultures, and arts. For filmmaking is susceptible to opposite trends of boundary formation and of rupture. While film production tends to be restricted by national and global regimes of finance and knowledge, as a collaborative and often demotic medium of producing meaning in multiple sensory archives, multiple sensory forms, the cinema also is open to competing social and political claims staked by the makers, financiers, and target audiences. The form could well be animated in ways that exceed or critique cognitive categories, be they statist, regional, or global. My own chapter explores the production archive of a small-scale border-crossing Urdu film company that functioned as something of a gift-type economy, spawning images which riddled censorship in 1980s Pakistan. In this vein, our chapters illuminate South Asian archives that have been neglected or that can be opened anew in the light of regional crossings, such as Madhuja Mukherjee's archaeology of pre-partition film cultures. Our joint effort, as explained in the introduction of the volume, is to offer a transregional approach that attempts to think beyond the restrictive notions of space and of mobility found, respectively, in area studies and in global studies of cinema and culture. Our idea of the transregional speaks to what has been called the mobility turn in area studies, the imperative to think beyond static geographies and cultural boundaries. While for us, transregional means movements of aesthetic material and critical processes across statist and subnational borders, it also signifies binary mobility, the process of moving to a one-sided destination that excludes other sides and perspectives. As such, our transregional framework complicates transnational studies of cultural mobility by illuminating regional filmic archives hitherto invisible in global spaces. We avoid the emphasis on migrations to the global north, frequent in transnational studies of cinema and culture. Our point also is to think beyond a south-north dichotomy to south-south relations of cinemas and sociality. While individual chapters delve into specific archives, they combine in a rare colloquy between frames of reference spread across India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. This book challenges the area-based containments that have come to shape the field of South Asian studies in Euro-American academies, containments that often make Indian studies and Hindu-centric critiques come to stand in for the field as a whole. Instead, our book seeks a comparative space of encounters between a multiplicity of historical perspectives and methodological choices. Chapters on trauma cinema in Bangladesh challenge historical oblivion by carving out a transnational common ground of political recognition, avoiding a parochial historical approach. On their part, studies of Pakistani cinema point to the historical difference underlying regional intersections of culture and language by showing that images of gender and sexuality grow relatively unstable as they travel from the Hindi screen to mainstream Pakistani cinema. South Asian Filmscapes Transregional Encounters does emphasize connectivity. At the same time, this book reveals the urgency of crossing both histories and structures of regional knowledge production such that we interrogate gaps and boundaries on both fronts. Now we will invite our contributing authors to say a few words each about their chapters, following the order of the three parts into which the book is divided. We showed the table of contents at the start. Authors' presentations will be followed by a brief commentary by our discussant, eminent Bangladeshi cinema historian, Professor Zakir Hussain Raju, who joins us from Dhaka. We will round out the program with a Q&A. We do request you to please write your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is to introduce part one of the book and the contributing authors in part one of the book. Part one of the book is called Nations and Regional Margins. It focuses on films navigating borders and differences internal to nation states of Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. Our first presenter is Professor Hamidul Haq from Dhaka University, currently visiting professor at the University of Notre Dame. His chapter title is National Identity and Cinematic Representation, Independent Films in Bangladesh. So Professor Hamidul Haq.
Hi, I must thank to the editors and University of Washington Press for allowing me to contribute a chapter in this great anthology. In my chapter, I analyze how independent filmmakers from Bangladesh have represented national identity in their films. First, I explored three approaches of Bengali Muslim identity. These include Bengaliness, Muslimness, and popular religion. Next, I outlined the history of Bangladeshi independent filmmaking from 1950s to now. Finally, I analyzed how independent art filmmakers have portrayed these identities in their cinematic text by looking at the works of leading Bangladeshi contemporary filmmakers, Tanvir Mukammel, Murshidul Islam, and Tariq Masood. If I describe the three approaches, Bengaliness is an ethno-linguistic identity of the nation that emerged in the Middle Ages in Bengal through Bengali literature and culture, and reached its peaks in the 1960s in the autonomy movement against the central West Pakistan government following the Bengali language movement in 1952 and leading the birth of the nation in 1971. On the other hand, Muslimness is a religious identity that was first evident in 19th century Bengal through a religious reformation. Later, Muslimness as a religious identity was converted into the Pakistan movement in 1910 to 1950 in British India. And I propose these two kind of identity approaches are dominant in the historiography of Bengali Muslim identity. Here I propose a third kind of syncretic identity, which I term popular religion, Buddhist Tantricism, Islamic Sufism, and Hindu Vaishnavism. All liberal streams of major religions gave birth to several popular religious practices in Bengal, cumulatively known as the Baul cult. And in the finding, I see the films made by Tanvir Mukammel and Murshidul Islam, they are on behalf of Bengaliness and sometimes against Muslimness as they portray the identity approaches. But in the films of Tariq Masood, he is okay with Bengaliness on behalf of Bengaliness, but he is not taking a clear antagonistic position against Muslimness. And as a solution of these two conflicting identities, he is proposing popular religious practices as a resolution of this conflict. So we see in his film, The Claybird, he is covering or portraying all three identity approaches with much sensitivity or sensible approaches. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Haq. Our second presenter is Professor Kamran Asghar Ali from the University of Texas at Austin. His chapter title, Female Friendship and Forbidden Desire, two films from 1960s Pakistan.
And thank you, Esha, and thank you to both of you, Elora and Esha, for bringing us all together in such a wonderfully produced and organized volume. Thank you, University of Washington. And I actually am not a cinema studies person. I'm an anthropologist by training. And the impetus for me to write on this medium, on cinema, is my engagement with popular culture in Pakistan. And one of the things that I've been thinking about for some years is that, how can we write histories of nation states, but also the region, outside the more formal and more dominant narratives that are sort of being given to us in certain kind of nationalist histories. And so in that engagement, and sort of influenced by some of the feminist scholars that who have sort of urged us to look at other places, at interstices and nooks and crannies and biographies and memoirs and other kinds of archives, to really think about the past. And one of the places that I thought a little bit that I've dabbled in is sort of, popular women's fiction. But then I also started looking at some cinematic representation. So these two films are part of that effort to really rethink through a different kind of archive, an archive which, of course, has its own world of aesthetics and creativity, of course, but to really talk about how a different kind of history can be written or imagined, or what has been left out from dominant narratives of histories that nation state tell themselves, or states tell themselves. So in this particular case, in both these cases, one of the things that cinema history in Pakistan sort of is, especially in the 50s and 60s, the production of cinema, one of the things that it was struggling with, and other colleagues have also written about it, is the issue of how the new film industry had to, of course, it was partly a continuation of the Bombay film industry. A lot of people came from there, as Nasreen Rahman Sahaba would, in her chapter as well, a lot of people were in Lahore, then went to Bombay and then came back. But having said that, the idea was that how do you create this new film industry with its own ideological boundaries, with the whole issue of Muslim nationalism and partition, and also the dominance of Urdu at one level, and to exclude the more Indic influences. So there's that tension, right? And you can't do without it, but you still have to have something new. So there is that tension as well. And then there are thematic issues. And so in one of the films that I choose is Saheli, the whole issue, I reread it in terms of, on the surface, it's about friendship between two women. And also there is a one person who's married to two women. So there's a sort of polygamous kind of relationship. But I've read it as a triangle, and very much influenced this. The director himself came from India, and M. Sadiq, who, and of course, this is the year also the film Chowdhury Ka Chand with Rahman, Guru Dutt and Wahida Rahman coming out. Again, a very classic, and also in literature you see it, and others have written about it, the whole issue of the triangle, the issue of the object of desire and two men. So over here, that sort of triangle is inverted with two women, and the male is and one male. But I've read it as a moment of homosociality, if not overt homosexuality, and the desire between these two women to be together, and the male in this, the husband is eventually, even in the last shot off camera. I'm not saying that. So the kind of relationship, the kind of friendship, the kind of affective closeness is between these two women. So I've sort of started to reread against the grain some of the depictions that that of course at that moment there's no queer theory or people are not explicitly talking about these things, but I'm rereading this archive in perhaps in the current moment. The other film is an experimental film by the journalist Ahmed Bashir, who actually, in a very interesting way, does two moves. One is the issue of rethinking Muslim nationalism and critiquing it by bringing in a lot of Indic influences, whether in dance forms, the Manipuri or Kathak, of course, they say it's Mughal and Muslim, whatever, but, and Bharatnatyam, which are basically temple sort of origin. And then also the use of Sindoor in the end. But the more explicit argument is around the issue of a broader notion of sexual desire in old age, and even a very strong hint towards incest, and how that sort of is played out. The person has a sort of interest in his own ward, a female ward, or someone who he is under his protection. So the resolution is very complicated, and you can read the thing, but I'm trying to bring out these kinds of themes within Pakistani cinema, which of course undermines some of the more received narratives about Pakistan and the stereotypes about the various kinds of cultural patterns, Muslimness, relative conservatism, and Islam and all that, and the way in which filmmakers were risking or critiquing dominant cultural norms and historiography. So or history or issues around sexuality or even desire. So that's, I'll end there, and thank you again.
All right. Our third presenter is Dr. Amit Ranjan from National University of Singapore. Chapter title, Bringing Back Sikhs from the 1984, after the 1984 pogrom, the politics of picturization in Hindi cinema.
Thanks, Professor Esha and Elora, for giving me the opportunity to write on this topic. And also thanks to University of Washington Press for wonderful editing the book, and also giving me some suggestions to make my chapter more and more valuable and intellectually effective. My chapter discusses how the marginal community, which never thought that it is marginal before 1984, found itself at the margins after the assassination of the then Indian Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, by her Sikh bodyguards, that was followed by anti-Sikh program in India. The Sikhs in India accepted after that the brute fact that they constitute only 2% of the total population and can also face violent attacks from the majority community. However, given the significance of the Sikh community in society, army, and economy, the Indian state could not afford to keep the community disgruntled for a long time. In the 1990s, reconciliation process started by the state, to which the Hindi film industry also became a part. Sikh characters, which were never shown in the leading role, with a few notable exceptions, especially in art cinema, suddenly attained significance. Films such as Border, Gadari, Prem Katha, Major Sahab, Singh King, etc. released in succession, and most of them did very well at the box office. In my chapter, I have talked about popular Hindi films of that time. Border, which was released in 1997, and Gadari Prem Katha, that was released in 2002. Both films show Sikh as a protector of the Indian territory and at a war against Pakistan, which the country which most of the Indian call as an enemy state. Besides, in both films, the Sikh characters largely present themselves as a Hindu or like Hindu or closely related to Hindus. This is in contrast to the demands of the larger Sikh community, who see themselves as a different religious group and not a different sect within Hinduism. During the time of the militancy in Punjab, the demand to recognize Sikhs as a different religious group and not a sect within Hinduism was strongly raised. Also, the closeness of Sikh with the Hindus was contrary to what happened in 1984 when many Sikh, especially from Sikh regiment and Sikhai regiment, left the army and went to fight. Even 1971 war decorated army officer, Major General Sehwag Singh. He was a part of the militant group, and he used to train. Means there was had been examples where he trained many Sikh militants. So for my chapter, I did some fieldwork in New Delhi, especially in areas where Sikhs were attacked, especially in Trilokpuri. And then there's a place called Sagarpuri where many of the Sikhs who were attacked, they have been relocated. And I talked to many individuals whose grandparents or parents were attacked at that point of time, and that attack had changed them to change their lifestyles. No archives have been looked at, but yes, I had to watch the two films discussed in my chapter many times. Thanks.
Okay, our fourth presentation is by, thank you so much for that, Amit. Our fourth presentation is by Professor Glenn Hill from the University of Sydney and Kobita Chakma from the Chittagong Hill Tracts Indigenous Jumma Association, Australia. Their chapter title, Silencing Films from the Chittagong Hill Tracts, Indigenous Cinema's Challenge to the Imagined Homogeneity of Bangladesh. The presentation is pre-recorded because, of course, it's 4 a.m. in Australia just now. So we'll take just a moment to upload the presentation.
Hello from Australia. I'm Kobita Chakma.
And I'm co-author Glenn Hill.
I'm originally from Bangladesh and Glenn is Australian. Our chapter is about the relation between cinema and the indigenous peoples of Bangladesh, particularly how it's been used to construct indigenous identity and how it's now being used by indigenous people themselves to construct their own identity. The 5 million indigenous people in Bangladesh are a small minority. While the majority in Bangladesh are Bengali Muslims, indigenous peoples have a diversity of ethnicities and religions. There are about 35 indigenous languages spoken in Bangladesh. The method of research involved analyzing the catalogue of both mainstream and marginal cinema since Bangladesh's independence in 1971, which either portrayed indigenous peoples or were made by indigenous peoples. In the chapter, we developed a proposition that there are 3 ways that cinema can be conceptualized in relation to indigenous peoples. This follows a somewhat chronological development, but not entirely. The first is where indigenous peoples are just represented as an exotic backdrop. We call this scenographic films. Most of these don't even use indigenous actors to portray indigenous people. The second is where films are made by non-indigenous filmmakers but are sympathetic to indigenous issues. We call these exogenous films. They often fall short in areas such as imposing national narratives or representing indigenous peoples using ethnographic stereotypes. The third is where films are made from the perspective of the indigenous peoples themselves. We call these endogenous films. They generally fit into Barry Buckley's category of indigenous or fourth cinema. Indigenous cinema in Bangladesh has been subject to nationalist prejudice and censorship. Most recently, the multi-award-winning indigenous film Mothengari, My Bicycle, can't be shown in Bangladesh. Cinema has acted as a mirror to represent Bangladeshi identity. If we were trying to sum up the most significant point of the chapter, it would be to question the hegemonic representation of Bangladesh as only made up of Bengali Muslims. If cinema mirrored the true diversity of Bangladesh, it might act as an agent of change toward a more heterogeneous identity for Bangladesh. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
The final presenter for part 1 is Dr. Nasreen Rahman from Beacon House University, Pakistan. Her chapter title, Pakistan, History and Sleep, Hassan Tariq, a Progressive Patriarch and Need. Over to Nasreen, please.
So I'm a historian of emotions and aesthetics and a human rights activist. I want to begin with thanking Esha and Elora for drawing me into the SAMSNet community and the conferences that followed. I view the initiative as a profoundly political act, witnessing the assaults on gender and social justice, equity and plurality in the name of democracy and nationalism. I would say SAMSNet is a much needed act of moral courage. And of course, a big vote of thanks to Shilpi, Emma and Brittany and everyone else involved in bringing this volume together. Importantly, I would like to thank Abhijit and Madhuja at Jadavpur University and the students Shraddhanjali and Shubhajit who looked after me in Calcutta and helped me present my paper, which morphed into the chapter in this book and feeds into a larger book project. First, how does my chapter speak to questions of margins and difference in national film traditions? Well, in the paper, I skirt around questions of margins within Pakistan, of religion, class, gender, and of course, the transformation of time and space, the eternal affair of a historian. I explore the film Neend to understand the Pakistani subject in an attempt to suture and unsuture the aporia at the heart of the nation's will to a whole and the subject's will to the artistic, scientific, political, and amorous, more everyday concerns. The second question refers to the newness of my archive. Of course, film is not a new archive. Nevertheless, I do not think that the film Neend has been studied before by scholars, although Kamran Azdarali has written about Hassan Tariq's film Behan Bhai. Our two papers are bookends, with Neend marking the beginning of the Ayub era and Behan Bhai in '69, the end of that era, in my attempt to understand the predicaments of Sanvari, the heroine who sleeps. I have studied the hitherto unstudied archive of the Family Planning Association of Pakistan at the Wellcome Trust in London. My forthcoming book has a comparative study of Neend and Begum Jan, Hassan Tariq's '77 remake of the same story in the Bhutto era. My departure is perhaps my call for an exploration of the cinema as a multisensory archive, while other scholars have turned to the Nat Shastra in analyzing Indian cinema. I argue that we should consider an analysis of rasa, a mood aesthetic, and the asthai bhava, the sustained temper of a film or a moment in a film. I assert that the articulation of a rasa is what Nietzsche has described as the materialization of the arts as a will to power. Our gathering today, necessitated by COVID-19, is an example of deeply felt and practiced rasa and asthai bhava of dissent to heal wounds and confront pathologies of communal and nationalist loathing, a call for peace in a nuclear-armed context and a highly charged context. I want to really say again, I'm very proud to be part of this collective, and bravo Esha and Elora.
For all to all the presenters for section 1, I now turn it over to Elora to introduce sections 2 and 3.
Yes, thank you, Esha. So we begin part 2 presentations. This part of the book is titled Transregional Crossings and focuses on filmic histories of porosity and cross-fertilization on the subcontinent and beyond. And we begin with Madhuja Mukherjee from Jadavpur University, India. The title of her chapter is The Public in the Cities.
Hello, hello. Thank you very much, Elora and Esha. I'm so happy to be here, even if virtually, and I'm particularly happy to see some of the friends. We've been, as Nasreen mentioned, that this is indeed a great project to bring us together. Uh, researchers, historians, film studies people, as it were, within this fold of cross-border dialogues. And this is so necessary in the current times, and this is so important to keep this movement, as it were, alive. Thank you very much. So briefly, my chapter within the frame of South Asian Filmscape, as Elora mentioned, is about the public in the cities. And I'm particularly talking about cross-border mobilities and the borders, which have actually remained quite porous. So I'm specifically looking into the narratives of film screening. So on one hand, it is about mobility, about movement. On the other, it is also about specific places and about the idea of a space. So these are constructed through the narratives and histories of film screenings at the movie theaters located in particular cities such as Bombay, Lahore, and Calcutta. I'm drawing also, as a method, my method overlaps with the anthology which me and my co-editor Monica Mehta, who is also present here today, are pursuing for some time now, which we call as networks of industries and people of aesthetics, as Esha mentioned. So in this chapter, I'm particularly looking at place, location, but also the movement of films and capital across the cities. I am heavily drawing from the material, the information that is available in the Indian Cinematograph Committee report, which was published in 28, and the interviews were conducted in 1927. So I'm using it as a resource, as a data, as it were, as a material, as opposed to a kind of a reading that has been done, which is an ideological reading of the intentions of the empire in the way the subcontinent was seen, was attempted to see as as a homogeneous whole. So drawing from that, especially from the interviews of the movie theater owners, I am primarily looking into a very, very complex film culture and also an idea of a taste culture, which is growing from multiple cross currents of films from Bombay arriving at different places, or film from the America arriving in these places, but also locally made films, those of Falke and Himanshu Rai of Bombay Talkies calls it as an international art. So this is the movement of particularly the film Light of Asia 1921. So it's through these kinds of viewing cultures that I'm trying to study a kind of a complex situation, which tells us about, of course, as to how at one level as to how these communities were forming across the class lines, but also how disparate these cultures. So there are overlaps in terms of as to how kinds of films that the elites view in Lahore or in Calcutta, but also the how these film cultures sort of shift even within this city from mohalla to mohalla. So that is something quite interesting, where in one of the interviews, a hall, a movie theater or a cinema hall owner says that North Calcutta is of mostly there are the quote unquote what Bengalis like to call as non-Bengalis. So the chapter principally studies, cinema as a locus through which the urban cultures were forming and consolidating, but also as to how a city, the architecture of the city, the map of the city, as it were reorganizing around theaters. So I argue that the history of movie theaters enables us to understand the political cultural histories of South Asia, of places which are of countries, or place, mm, you know, yeah, countries would be a good word to, India, Bangladesh and Pakistan. So but it allows us to understand the sort of the growing uh, mm, cultural field in these places, especially the big cities that I'm talking about, Bombay, Calcutta, and Lahore, and critically look into the overlaps as well as the differences of a very intense history of colonization as well as nationalism, and the questions of language movement and growing internationalism. So these the overlaps and the differences are amazing, and through this cultures of film viewing, it allows us to look at many things, but principally what this book intends to do, the question of porous borders, mobility, but also histories of specific histories of places. Yeah, and it also tells us how media histories and ecologies were formed. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Madhuja. We will go next to Hari Prasad Athanikal from the English and Foreign Language University in India. The title of his chapter is Realism and Region in South Indian Cinema.
Hi. Thank you very much, Professor Elora and Esha. We have had very long discussions over the chapter and how the book is sort of taken shape. My paper, in fact, grapples with 3 decades for languages, for language film industries, and both popular and new wave cinema in South India. In fact, I'm looking at this 3 decades of cinema, both popular and new wave cinema, through the lens of realism, and how sort of realism has evolved in certain new wave filmmakers in South India. The usual practice is to look at new wave cinema as an independent art form, without having much to do with the larger, mainstream cinema as such. So, with the peculiar organization of the narrative and the compromises that the cinema makes with larger political and social systems, it is usually believed that the mainstream cinema will never be able to venture into higher forms of realism. In fact, this chapter attempts to situate new wave South Indian cinema directors, in relation to mainstream South Indian cinematic traditions. I argue that even though at first glance, new wave cinema appears to be quite disconnected from mainstream cinema, on closer reading, we can find the new wave builds on the realistic aesthetics that were already developing in the mainstream cinema. So the new wave directors provide is a much more nuanced, reflexive, and analytical approach in their work. And my position is that realistic aesthetics were already present in mainstream cinema, but that the new wave filmmakers of the 1960s and 1970s brought a reflexive approach that previously had been missing from cinema. So this particular approach, the progress of an aesthetics that I'm sort of tracing, would be against the statist understanding, nation-state understanding of cinema studies, which is probably the predominant mode of studying Indian cinema currently. So rather than reading cinema as an allegorical reading of the nation and state, which moved through aspirations for an independent nation towards a fruitful creation attempt at realism in the 1970s. So several movements in mainstream Indian cinema had direct or indirect affiliations with the nation's political history. And I'm particularly interested in the movement of these aesthetics from predominantly Hindi-based nationalist endeavors, where it was mostly a plastic realism, to sort of borrow a term from Andre Bazin, to regional language-based, basic realism, to borrow another term from Siegfried Krakow. So the chapter analyzes several representative films from Malayalam and Tamil, with occasional references to Kannada and Telugu films made in the 3 decades after the independence of India, arguing that the literary aesthetics of realism prevalent during this period did not necessarily morph into a cinematic realistic tradition in the 1950s and 60s. So what I'm trying to do here is to look at several kinds of ideas that I can sort of gather from these 4 regional film industry. So in that sense, I'm looking at the material culture. I'm looking at the way in which certain technologies have developed, how state is intervening, how industry is intervening, how the politics of location works in certain areas. And in the second part of the paper, I looked at the politics of space, and I'm looking at Telugu and Kannada cinemas, where there was an insistence on making films in the region itself, so that it becomes an authentic representation of the space. And in that respect, they were given several financial assistance from the side of the state itself. In discussing Tamil cinema, I was talking about the roots of realism in popular cinema in Tamil. Sometimes the idea that I was looking at in this particular section is the idea of Ur, the social location, sociological, anthropological term of the social location, a village, sometimes one's land, one's space itself, and how that gets represented in certain new realistic films in the 1950s and 60s. Another aspect that I discuss in the paper is the song picturization, and how in fact, song picturization is where we find cinema moving out of the studio for the first time, and that means it becomes the first moment where cinema goes out into the spaces. And the conclusion part, where I was looking at the reflective, self-conscious, political kind of realism that has sort of developed with the new wave filmmakers. And I would end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we move next to Gwendolyn Kirk from Lums, Pakistan. The title of her chapter is "This is London, Not Pakistan."
Yes, thank you so much. I want to echo everybody else's extreme gratitude to Elora and to Esha for their amazing work in putting together this volume, their guidance on the writing, and just at every step of the way. And it's so wonderful to see this project kind of come to fruition, especially, thinking of how far things have come from when I first participated with this collective in 2016 in Lahore, and it's just been a delightful effort to be a part of. So I'm really grateful to the two of you. Anyway, my paper is on articulations of diaspora in Pakistani Punjabi film. And I'm looking at 2 films in detail. So these were made about a decade apart, and I'm using them as a lens to understand kind of shifting conceptions of Punjabi identity, so of ethnic regional identity in Pakistan through its portrayal of a Western other and through its kind of treatment of Western settings. So the first film is from 1971. It's called Pelwanji in London, directed by Chowdhury. And it narrates the story of one of these traditional wrestlers, a Pelwan from Lahore. And he goes on this journey to London to earn money and get his sister married off and unite his family and all those things that one does when one is a character in a South Asian movie that goes to London. So this was the film in 71, right? And then in 81, so 10 years later, came Yunus Malik's Jat in London, which of course is the first of many sequels and spin-offs to this sort of wildly successful and genre-defining film Maula Jat, which many of you are probably familiar with. So Pelwanji in London came out in November of 71. So this is really a turning point for Pakistani national identity, of course, as well as for its film industry, because the film industry is going to become very heavily refigured after it loses half of its circuit and a large proportion of its personnel with the independence of Bangladesh. And this is also a moment, of course, of growing migration from South Asia to the West. And so in this context, the film aligns really neatly with classic responses to globalization, growing diaspora population. And we see this in many other South Asian films of the era, like Pura Bur Pashchim or something. So the hero manages to avoid the pitfalls of corruption of the West and scantily clad women and alcohol and nightclubs and things, and defeat the British wrestler and win enough money to get his sister married and everybody's happy. But the treatment of Punjabi identity we see really shift in the 10 years. So after the independence of Bangladesh, you have this massive refiguring in the film industry, and Punjabi film really rises to prominence. And the watershed moment is 79 with the release of Maula Jat, the prequel to Maula Jat in London, which is also, of course, the year that Zia-ul Haq takes power in Pakistan. So we have a military coup and this kind of very brutal military regime installed. And so what happens in the later film is there's no kind of moral questioning of, oh, these westernized Pakistanis and how do you negotiate your identity in a diaspora setting. The film is really remarkable in that it actually fully ignores most of these questions, except there's like a few references to scantily clad white women, but otherwise it's kind of totally ignored. And rather, even the Pakistanis in London here are wearing like dhoti and kurta, and they're playing out the same kind of battles and the same conflicts that they were playing in Pakistan. So these sort of like intercaste conflicts between Jats and Nuts. Why I argue this is significant is it really centers this rural, hyper-local or like localized Punjabi identity, which is kind of subverting and undermining the authority of the Pakistani nation state. So London is almost acting as a proxy for Pakistan, because of course there was also a kind of a brutal censorship regime that came along with the military dictatorship, and this kind of theme of subversion of the state and highlighting rural and hyper-masculine and kind of honor-based indigenous moralities, Punjabi moralities, became a dominant theme of cinema during Punjabi cinema's heyday of the 80s and 90s. So I'll end it there because I know time is quite short, but just with one final thought that, really what I'm trying to say is we can read these films as moments of encounter with the West, of course, but also we have to read them as products of this kind of subnational and hyper-regional cinema, rather than any kind of a national cinema, or in fact, anti to a national cinema. And in fact, as products of a cinema that's had a really historically kind of complex, ambivalent relationship with the nation, with the nation state. And so it gives us kind of a different perspective on transnationalism and globalization. So that's it. Thank you so much for letting me be part of this wonderful effort. And I'm looking forward to hearing everyone else's papers.
So we'll move right on to Zebunissa Hameed, also from Lums, Pakistan. And the title of her chapter is The Birth of a Cinema.
Thank you. The title of my chapter is The Birth of a Cinema in Post 9/11 Pakistan. So please excuse the clickbait title there. Thank you to Elora and Esha and everyone who has made this possible. I'm not sure if you can. I think I'm having a bit of connection with my internet. I don't know if you can hear me. But...
We can hear you.
Okay, sorry, I just disappeared for a second. But thank you all very much. My work is on New Pakistani Cinema, or NPC, as I call it, and I just want to really highlight that this is not a revival of a cinema. This is not a continuation of cinema. And my friend Gwendolyn Kirk and I have been arguing for this for multiple Pakistani cinemas, so that the diversity of the film landscape can be clear, and also so that we can get along with each other. That's how we could, continue talking to each other, by allowing for multiple Pakistani filmic identities. So this chapter primarily looks at the growth of New Pakistani cinema and what led to that growth, the factors post 2001, the licensing of television channels, private television channels, how Indian films became allowed. Indian films were banned in Pakistan since 1965, and in Pakistani films in India. And in 2007, they were allowed to be screened in Pakistani cinemas. And that really changed the landscape. And as Hollywood and Bollywood films moved towards this digitalization of this transition into digital cinema, new digital cinemas came out in Pakistan. And this created a space for an urban digital cinema to emerge within the country. And one of the things that I focus on this chapter, and that I find really fascinating, is the connections between between Hollywood and Bollywood, but also this idea of the transnational cinematic city, which I argue is a space that can be seen as a link between global centers of the developing world, where stories of migration and stories of crisis of masculinity, violence, undertones of violence are really hashed out and fleshed out. And this is something you can see in New Pakistani cinema, and you can compare it to Mexican cinema and other cinemas. And that's what's really one of the things that I find fascinating. And I in the chapter, I said at some point, I was rereading it, and I said, that it's very exciting to study an industry in real time, to see it develop. I didn't mean it should be this exciting that we, what happens after the pandemic and so on. So one of the things now that I think that's going to be very interesting is to see how New Pakistani cinema, because it's in many ways is hostage to the state of Indo-Pak relations, as well as the ban culture that we've been seeing, and now the COVID-19 pandemic. So it'll be interesting to see what the next few years will look like. And yes, that's my chapter. Thank you.
So our final presentation in this section is from Lotte Hoy, and she's joining us from the University of Edinburgh. The title of her chapter is Cross-Wing Filmmaking, East Pakistani Urdu Films and Their Traces in the Bangladesh Film Archive.
Thank you. Thanks to Elora and Esha and to all my co-contributors. It's wonderful to be here. So very briefly, my chapter, Crosswing Filmmaking, is about the relationship between East and West Pakistan in the history of Bangladeshi cinema. It's a sort of a dynamic that film historiography in both contemporary Bangladesh and Pakistan tends to forget due to the pool of nationalist narratives on film studies and historiography. In part, it is also to do with the fragmented nature of the archive, which parts of this puzzle located in different countries with and out with South Asia. And so the chapter itself is centered around a key protagonist of this dynamic, someone who was a child actor at the time and then subsequently grew into a media mogul. which of course is an excellent topic for a short film, but that is for somebody else. And so what spoke to most to my imagination around this figure was that he could himself not remember what language the film, which was called President, and then after censorship was called Son of Pakistan, whether this was made in Bangla or in Urdu. And so I took this as an opportunity to investigate, and in the process found a lot of archival material that pointed to a flourishing collaboration, and of course also flourishing markets between the two halves of Pakistan. So I think this points to the central truth of Elora and Esha's wonderful volume, which is that cinematic pleasures are rarely confined to boundaries and forced impositions about difference and danger. And so the irony of the chapter in the end, that what I found out about the film was that it was neither in Bangla nor in Urdu, and a much esteemed senior academic colleague, who I also quote in the paper and is in fact in the room today, our friend and colleague Kamran Bhai, pointed out to me that in fact the film had been in English, but nobody seemed to remember this because it now was a controversy. And so if I think about what this project for me is, it's about thinking about looking at existing sources and archives in new ways through ethnographic fieldwork and interviews and serendipity, film magazines, newspapers, state records. And while they're not really hard to find, I don't think, they tend to be put to different purposes than the things that I'm interested in parsing. So that's what the chapter is about. Thank you.
Thank you, Lotte. I just want to thank everybody for bearing with us in true South Asian style. We are running behind, but this is a very rare opportunity that we have gathered scholars from, as I mentioned earlier, 7 different countries. So we are now approaching the third and final section of the book titled Fractured Geographies, South Connectivities. And this section focuses on border war and trauma films that are anchored in the subcontinent while they intersect with activist cinema and liberation movements across regions of the global South. And we will begin our presentation with Professor Fahmida Akhtar from Jahangirnagar University, Bangladesh. And the title of her chapter is Zahir Raihan's Stop Genocide.
Thanks. It's really wonderful to be here at this book launching ceremony of a rich collection of South Asian films. Thanks to the editors, Professor Elora Halim Chowdhury and Professor Esha Niyogi for their brilliant and hard work on this publication. I'd also like to thank the University of Washington Press. Congratulations to the editors and to all the contributors. Now let me present briefly my chapter. As you heard, that the title of my chapter, Zahir Raihan's Stop Genocide, a dialectical cinematic message to the world. Stop Genocide is a documentary film by the Bangladeshi film director Zahir Raihan made during the liberation war of Bangladesh. This black and white documentary is widely considered to be the most authentic, artistic, and positive treatment of the liberation war. I suggest that Stop Genocide is an ethical cinematic appeal for humanity and justice. In echoing the dialectics of third cinema, Stop Genocide depicts both the genocide that took place in Bangladesh in 1971 and its causes and consequences by focusing on the inert response of the United Nations to the barbarous acts committed by the Pakistani forces in Bangladesh. The film, to some extent, criticizes the United States for indirectly sponsoring the atrocities of the war through its support for Pakistan in form of arms and ammunition provision. The film, in 3 subsequent sequences, by placing together 3 realities, the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the violation of human rights in Vietnam and in Bangladesh, reveals the contradictory values and promises of the world's authorities. Thus, it creates here an alienation effect, the central device of Brecht's epic theater. Most of the sequence conclude with a freeze frame for a few seconds with the word stop imposed in the voiceover narration. With this recurring anti-realistic effect, the director assigns a mild shock, a break, to disrupt the continuity of the war narratives and makes the audience critically aware about the conditions of the war. Despite having impulses of third cinema structure, Stop Genocide reconstructs gender stereotypes. Raihan represents women as a collective body of torture victims who are passive, voiceless, and non-combative. In most cases, this victimization of women has been eroticized by picturing them in terms of endangered motherhood, which is a common trope developed by the Bengali writers, artists in their works during the crisis moment in national history. In contrast, Bengali men in the film are mainly depicted as active freedom fighters and protectors of the nation. Even with some limitations, the film, which is made during the gruesome situation of war, at the national level, Stop Genocide records the struggle for freedom of a colonized nation, while at the international level, it participates in an anti-imperialist struggle by highlighting the contradictory attitudes and actions of the US and UN. Ultimately, the film aims to bring about a new society free from all kinds of oppression and injustice. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving now to Alka Kurian from University of Washington, Bothell. The title of her chapter, Gender, War, and Resistance, The Case of Kashmir.
Thank you so much, Elora and Esha, for including me in your volume. I'm delighted not only to be present in your volume, but also this is such a great opportunity for me to meet all the co-conspirators who have sort of been working along with you and under your excellent leadership and guidance. So the focus of my chapter is threefold in its efforts to engage in a South-South conversation of gender dissent and resistance to militarism, occupation, and repression between India and Indian Kashmir. It surfaces some of the key documentary films that deal with the physical and emotional fallout of the conflict in Kashmir, represented as a site of pain, trauma, and resistance to brutal state repression. While much has been written on the volatile region of Kashmir, most of the scholarship tends to focus on the political and territorial conflict between Pakistan and India. What gets left out in this discourse is its impact on the people, the ways in which people experience their conflict daily, or this conflict daily, and the lived reality of the loss and grief that results. Moreover, in areas riddled by political conflict, women's narratives tend to go unreported. What gets highlighted is their victimization. However, an increasing number of women use art as a tool to resist this narrative undergirded by systemic and interlocking structures of oppression. So the two female filmmakers that I refer to that I explore the works of in my chapter are documentary filmmakers Ifat Fatima, in particular looking at her film Blood Leaves Its Trail and Where Have You Hidden My New Moon Crescent, and Uzma Falak's film Till the Roads Carry Her. These two filmmakers offer powerful female-centric resistance narratives that challenge the state-led oppressive policies in Kashmir. And I must make it clear that the focus of my chapter is on Indian Kashmir, or Indian part of Kashmir, and not Pakistani part of Kashmir. While mainstream commercial films predominantly made by male filmmakers tend to verge on the propagandist independent films, again made mostly by men, tend to be genderalized, which reproduce a masculinist response to the Kashmir crisis. Women's cinema of conflict, on the other hand, is path-breaking, since women, as I mentioned, are rarely offered filmmaking opportunities in a field that has historically been dominated by non-Kashmiri men. Second, my chapter argues that by focusing on women-centered narratives, female documentarians make an important intervention and take the shared goal of filmmaking tradition farther by enabling marginalized women to voice their commonality of their experiences, which are grounded in their collective grief and rage. As pointed out by Lisa French, what's significant about films made by women is the ways in which their narratives are shaped by the female gaze and the visible female aesthetic approaches, worldviews, and treatment of subjects, themes, and the overall privileging of female subjectivity. Third, my chapter argues that these female women made by female documentarians of films made by female documentarians make an important intervention of dissent in the practices of silence, erasure, and self-censoring that result from processes of militarization. Unlike the male experience of suffering in the case of direct violence, such as torture, disappearances, deaths, etc., women's experience of violence inheres in the realm of the social, cultural, sexual, and economic. Their multi-layered oppression clearly has had the power to muzzle dissent among women who have traditionally relied on a strategy of silence and the use of censored language, which heightens their victimization. This facade of silence, however, has been crumbling over time. Unlike women in other parts of the Muslim world, and despite being entrenched in patriarchy, Kashmiri women have enjoyed relative freedom, which comes from a culture of gendered integration rather than segregation within the cultural and regional spheres, as well as equal participation in traditional forms of labor such as agriculture. So my chapter examines the ways in which, despite their vulnerability to sexual violence and in spite of experience some of the worst human rights violations, Muslim Kashmiri women have gone beyond their cultural symbolism as widows, half-widows, or grieving mothers. Their resistance narratives helps us understand the profoundly subversive role that they play, not only through a deliberate reinscription of gender within the masculinist process of militarization, highlighting questions of state culpability and legitimacy, but also in the struggle for independence from the Indian state. Something, of course, at the time when I was writing this chapter, the Article 370 had not been written down. So the context has changed fundamentally. Further, I explored the medium of documentary films and as an artistic corollary of women speaking out, helping to sustain the public memory of a crime and attempting to force the state to take responsibility both for its acts of violence and for the victims. The filmic narratives are articulated with the goal of ensuring social recognition of the hurt and making the case that those who were hurt deserve justice. When one recognizes suffering, one begins to understand impunity as an act of the state dehumanizing itself, justifying its criminality on the basis of lies and untruths. While social recognition doesn't always lead to justice or legal victories, it does mobilize what V. Gita refers to as an ethical effect, which means a lot to the victim. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but certainly not the least, we go to Nadir Junaid from Dhaka University. The title of his chapter, Cinema That Raises a Critical Consciousness, the films of Alamgir Kobir.
It was wonderful listening to all these interesting, insightful presentations. Before I talk about my chapter, I would like to congratulate Dr. Elora Halim Chowdhury and Dr. Esha Niyogi on their success in editing this important book. I'm sure this book would help the readers develop an informed understanding about South Asian films. When Dr. Elora requested me to write a chapter for this book, I immediately decided that I would write on Alamgir Kobir's films. Alamgir Kobir was a socially conscious filmmaker of our country who died in a car accident in 1989. It was a premature death, of course. I've seen that in Western countries, discussions do not take place very often about those Bangladeshi and Indian filmmakers who have demonstrated a predilection for formal experimentation and socially critical messages. Many Western audiences are not even familiar, I would say, with Satyajit Ray's films. When I was completing a master's in King's College London 17 years ago, I observed that only one student in the program knew about Satyajit Ray. And later, when I went to Australia for doing a PhD, I came across the same experience. That very few people knew about the artistic filmmakers and politically oriented filmmakers of India and in Bangladesh. But whereas they do have sufficient knowledge about the films of such as Federico Fellini or Michelangelo Antonioni or Bernardo Bertolucci, Buñuel, Bergman, and even about the Asian filmmakers such as Akira Kurosawa, Yasujiro Ozu, or Abbas Kiarostami, then Ho Shaoxian, Zhang Yimou, and many others. I would like to mention that when politically oriented films are discussed, we often see that Jean-Luc Godard, then Solonas and Getineau, Tilo Pontekov, or Glauber Rocha are often mentioned. But many people in the West do not know about Mrinal Sen's overtly political films made in a tumultuous political situation of India in the early 1970s, where he confronted the contemporary head on. So there is, I would say, I don't say that, I would say it's a kind of lack of writings available about the artistic filmmakers of Bangladesh or India, whereas like lots of focus, like we see with lots of focus on mainly like popular films of India as well as from Bangladesh. Bangladesh filmmakers aiming to reject conventional filmic devices and showing an interest in coming to terms with social problems remain unknown to many Western audiences. And it is frustrating that many young people in the society today in our country do not even know the name of a filmmaker like Alamgir Kabir, because the types of films he used to make are not in vogue in contemporary society in Bangladesh. And the people are constantly fed entertainment-based elements by the media. Most of the television dramas and films produced in our country these days are commercially motivated. The young people of our country are reared on a diet of such entertainment-based reproductions. And in most of our films, we observe a lack of interest in making formal experimentation. In contemporary Bangladeshi films, I would say, there is definitely there's a lack of interest in formal experimentation or to use unorthodox filmic devices. So I wrote a chapter on Alamgir Kabir in order to make the readers in different countries, not only in our country, in different countries, informed that in the past, certain Bangladeshi films were formally adventurous, and the cinema was used as an instrument for making for raising social consciousness. My chapter discusses 3 films by Kabir, and by reading the chapter, the readers will understand how the director dispensed with orthodox filmic conventions commonly seen in many Bangladeshi films. I analyzed the films mainly through the discussion of the cinematic language of his films and how through the deployment of certain innovative techniques, he made the form of his films politically motivated. In his films, he came to terms with the trauma and frustration faced by the freedom fighters and many others in post-independence society of Bangladesh. A sequence of his maiden feature showing the inner turmoil of a freedom fighter became quite similar to various scenes of Andre Bider's Ashes and seminal film Ashes and Diamonds, where the Polish filmmaker shows the confusion of a young Polish resistance fighter when Poland became free from Nazi occupation. In another feature, Kabir showed the political subjugation faced by the Bengalis during the Pakistani rule in the 1960s. He made this film when military rule had returned to independent Bangladesh. So the criticisms of the subjugation imposed by the Pakistan military authorities turned out to be sort of an indirect condemnation of the subjugation of politics and society by the military domination in Bangladesh at that time. In another film, he used a fantasy-oriented storyline to criticize the patriarchal control and the consequent trauma experienced by the women. So my chapter will help readers know about certain little explored Bangladeshi films that were aesthetically innovative and dealt with serious social issues. The readers will also get ideas about the problems troubling Bangladesh in the years after independence. Hopefully, greater discussions about Kabir's films and other socially critical filmmakers of our country, films made in Bangladesh in the past, will enable us to see that the dearth of socially aware, formal, innovative Bangladeshi films that we are witnessing at this moment will not exist in the days to come. So thank you very much. That's all.
Okay, so we have a brief commentary from Professor Zakir Hussain Raju, and I'll come to that in a minute. And then I see some wonderful questions in our Q&A box. So please, those of you who are interested in a little discussion, please stay on. We will round out the program with Professor Raju's comments, and then we'll open it to Q&A. We will go over time, South Asian style, but this is a rare opportunity. Please stay on for the discussion. Thank you. Okay, so Professor Zakir Hussain Raju is Head of Media and Communication and the director of the Center for Social Science Research at Independent University, Bangladesh, a leading researcher of Bangladesh national cinema and a scholar of Asian media and politics. He is the author of Bangladesh Cinema and National Identity in Search of the Modern from Routledge, London, 2015. So over to Professor Raju for a brief commentary. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Esha and Elora, for this wonderful event, of course, for the book and also for this, book talk launching event, and especially inviting me to say a few words. I do think that I have seen this book to grow, let's say. I mean, I'm probably indirectly, patched up in this book in different ways, but it is very nice to see the fruition of this project over last few years. I had numerous email exchanges with Esha and Elora, and actually I am meeting Esha for the first time today. I mean, at least virtually. And of course, there are all these usual suspects, many of my very good friends in this gathering today, many of whom I know for probably more than 20 years, and many of whom I bumped into conferences here and there. I have been asked to give a commentary on the book, and also in relation to my own work, and probably with the larger theme, which is this transcultural, transregional encounter of South Asian filmscape. Let me start with a personal note, let's say, and to meet some kind of parochial urge from myself. The thing is, I was counting in the list of contents that there are 6 chapters on Bangladesh cinema out of 15 chapters. So I would like to congratulate once more both the editors and also my Bangladeshi friends or friends who have written on some aspect of Bangladesh cinema. I think around 25 years back, I began my PhD journey when I started writing this book, Bangladesh Cinema and National Identity, which got published from Routledge, a number of years after. I never imagined that there will be like, 6 other, researchers of Bangladesh cinema who will be contributing in a book like this, which deals with not any national cinema of South Asia per se, rather, South Asian cinema in a very larger landscape. In the same note, may I add very quickly that there is also, this Dui Bangla, two Bengal discourse that, of course, Esha and Elora have already, covered in their introduction. But this is also very nice to see. But let me come out of my, say, parochial ground, because we are here to celebrate. We are here to celebrate this book, South Asian Filmscape, Transregional Encounters. But more importantly, I think we are celebrating here the coming of age of South Asian film studies. I do think that, let's say, in last 4 to 5 decades of South Asian film scholarship, we have come a long way. I would like to take you back for a moment to the 1970s, 80s, the period when the concept of South Asian film studies began. And at the beginning, of course, it was by the people like Rosie Thomas or Brian Shoesmith from Australia, probably Aruna Vasudev from New Delhi, and a bit later, all these, very famous stalwarts of Indian cinema, namely Ashish Radhaksha, Ravi Vasudevan. I would like to add Madhav Prasada, and of course our very own Moinak Bishwas and S.B. Srinivas. What I am trying to tell that there was a phase when South Asian cinema studies was an enterprise of some transnational Euro-American Western scholars coming to India and studying South Asian cinema. A bit later, eventually we moved to what I would call the national scholarship of South Asian cinema by the people, some of whom I have mentioned. But as we all know that eventually we have now gone a long way from the concept of national cinema. If you look at my own work, you will find that I began with this idea of Bangladesh cinema as a national cinema. If you, so I'm sure some of you must have looked at my book, and you will find that I take Bangladesh cinema as something like a misnomer, because cinema was long back when there was no Bangladesh. So in other words, the cinema of Bangladesh must traverse a vast, undercurrents and invisible interconnections. And I think eventually, over the years, I have gone through that pathway. I have, somewhat recuperated the notion of Bangladesh cinema from the very rigid concept of national cinema. And even I think not only for Bangladesh cinema, but what I'm trying to say that South Asian cinemas and probably all kind of national cinemas in quotation mark should be read and reviewed, looked at, analyzed, framed, rather in a trans-regional, transnational context. Otherwise, it becomes very, again, parochial. It becomes parochial because we are only looking at some contemporary political, cultural landscape, which does not tell us the actual, width and breadth of this whole cinematic culture of a particular community of people. I would say the importance of this book lies in this, fact, which I strongly believe that any national cinema in South Asia and elsewhere need to be read and discussed in a larger framework, and looking at, border crossings, fissures, gaps, absences, and, all kind of invisible networkings of a particular cinema. That is what I think Esha and Elora have tried quite, I would say, intentionally and rigorously. I would say that the middle part, which is termed as transregional crossings, that is probably, most loved by me. As I already said, that I do feel that we have to go for transregional understanding of filmic cultures. And the first part, which is titled as Nations and Regional Margins, I think that is what I meant by the regime of, national cinema study, that I myself, of course, took as my point of departure. But eventually, I went into going new territories. In the end part of my commentary, let me talk a little bit about my own work. That if you look at the book Bangladesh Cinema and National Identity in Search of the Modern, good news is Routledge has now issued a paperback, so it is much less pricier than before. Very briefly saying, I have tried to come up with two different frameworks. One I called cultural national modernity, another one I called nation state modernity. And I have gone through more than 100 years back throughout the 20th century up to the contemporary period, and to demonstrate how these two different notions of modernity actually, incorporated and interconnected, fought each other over the various historical junctions and actors. So from that part, actually, I have gone into, later on, I have written about Bollywood in Bangladesh. I have written about trans-Bengal exchange of cinematic culture in different journals and different books you may find. In Trans-Bengal Cinematic Exchange, I talk about contemporary films from Bangladesh, which has been remade in West Bengal in India. I also worked on, like a mutation of a Bangladeshi Western film, which is actually, copied from very famous Indian film Sholay, and how it has been made a Bangladeshi Western film. I think I have tried to give a context of this book, the contemporary South Asian film studies, as well as a few of my work. So let me once more, congratulate Elora and Esha, and I'm looking forward to more new ventures to work together. Thank you.
So we have some, we're definitely out, running beyond time, but we have some wonderful questions that maybe we can, address briefly, at least a couple of them. From Purnima Mankekar, stunningly important political and intellectual project. And I have two questions that emerge from my own research interests. How have these filmscapes been reconfigured by digital media? And two, how has cinema articulated with television, especially in Pakistan, which has such a rich tradition of television production? So I think that, yes, perhaps Zebunnisa, I wonder if you can speak to Purnima's question, and Gwen, Kamran, yeah.
Sure.
Naseem, yeah.
Thank you for that question. I think in terms of new Pakistani cinema, one aspect that there's a very strong link between television and film. Many of the private television channels actually set up film production wings, and that led to a lot of film production and exhibition. But one of the issues that came out of it was that a lot of films were then criticized as being television dramas on screen. These larger versions of television dramas. So there's a very intricate and oftentimes complicated relationship between the two. A lot of filmmakers are now, when they're making independent projects, it means that they're moving away from the television production houses. I don't know, I think if Gwen or Kamran or anybody wants to add more to that. I'm not sure if that answered the question at all, or.
So I can speak a little bit to kind of the flip side of that, which is so Punjabi cinema, and this is something that I go into detail in my book manuscript and in other places. Punjabi cinema has largely been excluded from the kind of digital revolution initially, and that is because of initially like a lack of screens that had digital projection systems that were interested in showing Punjabi films, as well as then on the production side, the expense and training and things that are required to transition from analog to digital cinema were not necessarily in the reach of many filmmakers in that industry. And so there was kind of I don't want to say a full collapse, because I also don't want to reify some of the popular discourses around the decline of Pakistani film industry, as Zebunnisa knows. But interestingly, YouTube has been a huge player in the past few years since it got unbanned, and has become even more massively popular in Pakistan. And so now feature-length Punjabi films are being made on digital cameras, but still kind of like kind of guerrilla style and very small budget productions, and then circulated on YouTube. And this is true for Punjabi films and for other like subnational cinemas. So Saraiki films are being made and circulated on YouTube. Balochi language films are being made and circulated on YouTube. And they skip the cinema entirely. So that like democratization of content, with all of the asterisks we would put on that, is also somehow enabling these film industries to kind of take new and interesting shapes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gwen. Thank you, Zabanisa. Let's get to actually connected to that. I'm seeing another question from Safura Arbab. My question is, how have depictions of violence in film evolved alongside with the political landscape? And on the contrary, have depictions of peace or non-violence been depicted as subversive counter-narratives to narratives of the state? And Safura is especially interested in Pashto films. So if anybody can talk to Pashto films, that would be great. So yeah, somebody working on Pakistani cinema, and then maybe we can deal with the question of violence also from the side of Bangladesh drama cinema. But yeah.
I don't have, I think Zabanisa and Chiniapa, or Gwen would be the best, but I'm sort of amused at the idea that whenever there is the issue of Pashto, it has to be violence, but that's me.
I tried.
Yeah, Naseem, you want to add to that?
I think Kamran sort of said it all quite succinctly. There's so many issues that have come up in digitization, in the change from and the relationship between television and the cinema. But as a historian, I think that the years, the transitions, say, are the liberation of Bangladesh and the tearing away and the loss in Pakistan of that particular kind of idea of being a Pakistani, okay, where Pakistanis were forced to look east towards the east because that was the majority of your population. So a very new kind of culture that Gwen and Zabanisa have really focused on, the new Pakistan, but also what happens during the Bhutto and the Zia years to what's happening to performance and culture. So cinema is actually embedded in a wider loss and censorship as well. But it's not just a loss. Then what happens is that there's a lot of subversion that goes on, and where, and you've used the word margins, and is it right to call these margins, but where Punjabi cinema, where Pashto cinema, Baloch cinema, and now with the new digitization and all the new media that's there, there's a lot of subversion that's going on, and there's several counter narratives that are happening. So I think that this is a terrific opening, as it were, almost of a new field, or of a field that's there, and for people to step into that field really, and to examine and analyze what's happening over there. But there's a huge transformation that happens post 71 and then post Zia. And I think Kamran's doing a book on the 50s and 60s cinema. Gwen and Nisa are working on more contemporary cinema and all these regional cinemas. But what's very interesting is in this debate, I'm sorry, I don't want to hog the discussion, but very interestingly, I've just sort of made a note that usually when we discuss South Asian cinema, there's a kind of hegemony of Indian cinema, or Indian cinemas rather. And Pakistani and Bangladeshi cinemas are really pushed to the margins. And today what I find is that in this discussion, very little has been said about that hegemonic Bombay cinema, although Naveed did talk about it a bit. So, I mean, thank you. I mean, I just wanted to say thank you because there are lots of things that have come up. I'm not sure that I've answered the question properly, but certainly that the relationship between television and cinema in Pakistan far exceeds, or in fact, has exceeded into new digital technologies. I don't think that I've expressed that very well, but there is, the work that Gwen is doing in particular, and some of the issues that Nisa has talked about, of all these counter narratives that are happening through other technologies, YouTube, etc. I've even seen films being exchanged on phones. And they're complete films that are being exchanged on phones. So this whole thing about literary production, emotion, the production of emotion, and so on. So it's just a very rich field to step into.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Nasreen, for your comments, and Kamran. And of course, Gwen and Zavundisa, who started the discussion. There are two other aspects. Maybe we just want to touch on two other questions and then connected to what Naseem was saying also. And then, I guess we have to wrap up. But, I also I'm wondering if experts on Bangladeshi cinema who are with us would talk a little bit also to this question raised by Safura Arbab about, she says in all different languages, she's interested in all different languages. So the question is, how have depictions of violence in film evolved alongside with the political landscape? And on the contrary, have depictions of peace or non-violence in subversive or counter-narrative manners being presented? So yes, there is Raju, Nadir, Famida, Elora.
If I can just say a little bit that I think if we look at cinema by and about women in Bangladesh in particular, and some of the contemporary filmmakers like Rubaiyat Hossain, like Shamim Akhtar, who have contributed to this genre of national cinema in a way, although Raju Bhai has really pushed us to think beyond national cinema. But in the context of Bangladesh, there is an argument to be made that in national cinema that is often quite synonymous with Muktijuddha cinema, has had a particular masculinist type of narrative and vision. And these have been really challenged in more recent times by women filmmakers with really very rich depictions of diverse experiences and agency and resistance. Similar to some of the points that Alka was also making about films under occupation in Kashmir. So I wonder if Fahmida, who I know has done quite a bit of research on this, you would say something, and also Alka.
Thank you. Since Elora, you're also doing research on war films. So should I start or?
Yes, we can start with you.
About... Okay, so you're also doing research on war-based films, representation about women. So already you have discussed, you have told that Bangladeshi cinema actually portrayed, particularly war films, portrayed certain narrative in which we see the men are the protectors, they are the saviors of the nation, and women are represented as a passive victim. Yeah, and in case she's raped, she has to be we see her exit at the end of the film. But so while it is in case of war films, violence is there, certainly, since the violence started on 25th of March by the Pakistani attack. And war films requires arms, ammunition, and attack, counter attack. But see, Hameed Bhai, he actually narrated about the language of alternative filmmakers. In our country, actually, alternative filmmakers, they focused on the identity issues, and they borrowed the theme of the war again and again on their screen. Although in Bangladesh, during 70s and 80s, films were very social. But slowly, when VCR arrived in our country in the 80s, then we see that violence is splattered on the screen, and particularly after the death of our national leader, Bangabandhu, the action actually become a common trait in Bangladeshi film. And slowly the present condition of Bangladeshi film, particularly the popular Bangladeshi film, whether it is war film or not, action, sex, and it is actually in a very dismal condition now, the popular cinema at present. And this is a journey actually to following this decay. But in alternative filmmakers, they tried to, since they tried to portray not only portray the war, they sometimes portray the culture of our country, the heritage, the tradition. So there is possibility for them, there are possibilities for them to find the peace. But what I noticed, similar to Elora, that actually women actually, when they try to portray about peace or friendship or different views of the war, they have been attacked, particularly the director, by the so-called intellectuals. But we need to see the war and different narratives from different perspectives. So I think peace will come on Bangladeshi screen soon. And women, they are particularly the pioneer to making the peace, especially on screen. If we look back in the first women, Rebecca, have you seen this film, or do you know about Bindu Theke Brittu, from dot to circle? Anyway, so this is what I can say about peace and actions on Bangladeshi cinema. I think Lotte could tell more about this, because she also she knows cut. She did a lot of work on cut piece and action cinema.
Can I please say something?
Yes, Hameed.
Yeah, regarding the issue of violence. For mainstream cinema, after the advent of VCR, VCP in the 1980s, and the satellite television channels, then internet streaming, CDs, DVDs, all these external factors obliged the mainstream film industry to decline. They are not ready to face these challenges. So only selling point left was violence and sex. So at the end of 90s, especially in the beginning of the new century, they started making ultra-violent films with pornographic cut pieces, on which Lotte did her research. So that was the story of, and in 2007, there was a drive by Special Force, and this portrayal of, or making of ultra low budget, ultra violent films after 2007. But for me, that was the picture of the mainstream industry. But for the independent cinema, the violence is very much related to the war films. And if you see the political trajectory of Bangladesh, the people of Bangladesh are not ready to see any reconciliation or any peace on screen on war cinema. they want violence over there because the central West Pakistan or present Pakistan government, they didn't say sorry ever again. Never said sorry. Only one progress is there, that Bangladesh government has successfully tried the war criminals staying in Bangladesh, I mean the collaborators of the war, and that part is done. But what about the state-wise negotiation? It is not done yet. So Elora mentioned about the Dhaka University's ban on Pakistani scholars. It was on the point of that trial going on in Bangladesh because one after another, the war criminals were being hanged, and the Pakistani state, they officially responded to this process. And for that, the Bangladesh government perhaps asked Dhaka University to react, and that was the reaction. So I think peace is not possible at the moment. There was a film Elora mentioned, Meher Jan by Ruwayat Hussain. There was some kind of proposal of peace in that film, and the reaction was very extreme. People are not ready to see any story peace between Bangladesh and Pakistan because in that film there is a love affair between one Pakistani soldier and a Bangladeshi girl. So the reaction was very extreme, and the producer had to pull down the cinema from the theaters. So I think we should look forward for peace, but I think it doesn't matter what I understand, what I feel, but I think that the state Bangladesh is waiting for something. After that negotiation, peace might be possible in the state level and also on the screen. Thank you.
So can I just build on what the excellent point that Famidul Haq has just made, that I think more than the peace, what this cinema, the cinema of resistance articulated by female filmmakers highlights is the need for accountability. So while men reproduce violence and are direct victims of violence, women's cinema highlights not only the sociocultural and economic consequences of this violence, but also surfaces the politics of accountability. So, so more than the piece, I think what the filmmakers are trying to do is by centering the narratives of women and showing the terrible processes of their, or the reality of their suffering, it is bringing to the surface, the consequences and the violence and why, this accountability is important. And I think what is also important is to understand the ways in which they are reproducing these narratives from a specific gendered worldview. And finally, I also see the formulation of these cinematic narratives within the context of the larger, gendered politics that is happening across South Asia. And there is a great amount of osmosis and cross-cultural reproduction that is happening across the region. I also see that this renewed interest in gendered focused cinema is sort of spilling over into mainstream cinemas of India, I can say, so that there is a blurring of lines between mainstream cinema and an alternative cinema, where the focus on gendered experiences is also creating an atmosphere where people are sort of rethinking these important historical moments. So there's a revisioning of the partition cinema. And I think Elora's recent and upcoming work on partition cinema speaks very much to that.
Can I say something, or is there time? I mean, I'm sure people have to leave.
We can continue, and I would just say that if people need to leave, you can also leave, but we can we have the meeting set up until 2 o'clock, so we can continue the conversation among ourselves also.
Yeah, I mean, I may have to leave as well. No, I was just saying that I think what Professor Fahmidul Haq and others are raising is an important issue. I think within the Pakistani public and the state, there has to be a very strong recognition of the atrocities that were committed in their name and by the Pakistani military in 1971. And I think the issue is, and then how, I mean, one of the things that I've worked on and others have also is to, not in cinema, but at least how that whole period has been depicted in literature, right? And even there you have a lot of gaps and not a very clear way of thinking about what exactly the kind of violence that was unleashed on its own citizens. So that's something that needs to be on many levels addressed. But I just wanted to say a couple of things on peace. Looking at some of the cinema from the 50s and 60s, especially the 1959 film Kartar Singh, which is about, which is a very sort of, and almost 10 years after partition, a very sensitive and a very important film. It's in Punjabi and made by Saifuddin Saif. And it's about partition, and the most sympathetic character is of this film actor Zarif, who plays Vedji, who's the sort of the Ved, the Hindu Ved and he is the most sympathetic character. And it's about, and then in 1967, you have the Raza Mir and Zia Sarhadi film called Lakhon Mein Ek, which again is around Kashmir, actually, Halka. I mean, it is about Shakuntala, Shamimara plays that, and she sort of goes across the thing, and the way in which reconciliation is possible or what are the roads. So there have been attempts, at least, and in the way that I was saying earlier, in the 50s and 60s, there is constant attempt to bring in that has been being forcefully extracted from Pakistani national narrative into cinematic forms, right? And also, I think also in terms of literature, but how to present what we would consider, which were South Asian forms, but what now had become Indic forms, right? Or Hindu forms or modalities or cultural representations within cinema in a very positive way to really constantly challenge the emergent Muslim nationalistic myth that was being put forward. And so I think there is more to be done, and I think the issue of Bangladesh for Pakistan, I'll be very honest, and maybe some people are listening and I'll be on some list, is not even of amnesia, it's of erasure, from Pakistan national memory. It's an issue of erasure, and so it is. And that is something that some of us have to work within the sort of the sociological or the intellectual or even the political sphere of the nation state to constantly challenge. So I'll just stop here.
Wonderful. Yes. Okay, I think we have time for just one more discussion, and then we have to wrap up. And and I would actually like to read out a question from Ketu Katrak of University of California at Irvine. And many contributors to the significant volume note the issue of scattered archives. Could we discuss this scholarly matter, especially in excavating mainstream cinema in these regions of South Asia? A very important question that also speaks to the question of the hegemony of Indian cinema in the field, Indian cinema studies in the field, rather than, in production, I would say. And my own work actually deals with the traveling Urdu industry. The Urdu industry that travels and forges links in different parts of women-led Urdu industry that travels and forges links in different parts of South and Southeast Asia, but I'll bracket that for now, and actually raise the also the important question of gender and violence connected to mainstream cinema and the scattering of archives. Is it a question of pitting, or sort of pitting violent masculinism on screen, also through pornography, for instance, against hidden archives or alternative archives? Is it easy to talk about mainstream and alternative archives, that, or is there a permeation that we need to think about? On that note, I would love to call on Lotte Hoek to talk a little bit about scattered archives, gender and pornography and the complications, and then Madhuja Mukherjee, also from the point of view of Indian cinema, border crossing Indian cinema, and if they would talk a little bit each about Lotte about gender, sexuality, mainstream versus alternative, and the scattering of archives and what she has to bring to it, and then Madhuja.
All right, not a small challenge there. Just on archives, I think one of the key issues is that if we are sincere, especially in the context of Bangladesh and Pakistan, in thinking about where those archives could be, we probably have to move away from something that is intrinsic to the film industry itself and move towards political archives, moves to Secret Service files, move to other sites, the USIS. There are so many different ways in which the film industries in East and West Pakistan come off the ground in the late 40s, early 50s that are not specific to the film industry as an entertainment industry, right? And I think so if we want to excavate some of that history, we need to look at other sides. In terms of sexuality, I'll stick to that rather than gender. The pornographic archive, of course, is a hugely fluid one. Again, one that can be found historically that I'm less familiar with, but also in terms of its contemporary articulation. And a lot of the material that was produced on celluloid has afterlives in the digital world that circulate, that end up in porn chat sites, that end up in various hubs that can easily be accessed if you have a university willing to take the risk with you, or if you have a good server yourself. And so there are a lot of film archives to be excavated. It requires a little bit of enthusiasm around the topic, but it does allow the possibility of staging a comparative pornographic research project, set of research projects. And there is, I think, new research. And the interesting thing about porn in this context is, of course, that it is always unabashedly transregional. It never sticks easily to the national boundary, to the national tropes. And if it does so, it does always in a unexpectedly transgressive manner. So if we do want to think about peace and progress, while pornography can be violent and misogynistic and absolutely awful to have to watch, at the same time, it exemplifies a foregrounding of pleasure across boundaries in ways that other genres rarely do.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lotte, for that. Yes, absolutely. And your work is actually showing that as well, your current work. Awesome. Thank you. Madhuja, that would be our last commentator today.
Thank you very much, Esha. Hi, Lotte. Okay, I've been thinking from the time Raju Bhai was speaking about, the question of nation, and especially mentioning some of the scholarly, early scholarly research, mentioning some of the important scholars, that how the question that you raise about where is the archive, how to access the archive, what is an archive at all. And it is interesting to think that as to how Indian cinema, the idea of Indian cinema was framed around Hindi cinema actually. So, right, so it was predominantly the kind of Hindi cinema that was produced from Bombay. So in that sense, the hegemony of Indian cinema in the in research is actually the hegemony of Hindi cinema, the study of a particular language film produced from a certain center, of course, also precisely because of its intra and interregional kind of a reach and circulation, and the places where they're available beyond, let's say, South Asia, also beyond South Asia. So, but what I find interesting is the new methods that begin. Not only the concerns, that emerge of trying to first raise questions about what do we understand by the nation region kind of dichotomy, in the Indian context that I'm talking about. uh, but more language specific and industry specific studies have come up. And so both and then we see that films produced from what is like a political map of, let's say, Kerala, and the language Malayalam. There are multiple other industries that are, or in case of West Bengal, that I have personally worked on, let's say, the Manbhum films, the videos that are produced, or the Malegaon films from Maharashtra, which are far more well known. So these then we see that both that this hegemony of scholar kind of research that we have seen for the last maybe from the early phase of film studies from the 90s, let's say, to a more studies of Bollywood. This is really a new turn that we can see, that we are not only so it's a very interesting frame that we see, that we are expanding in terms of beyond Bombay cinema to the idea of the different language film productions that happen in India. But now, in the context of your book, or our book rather, it is in this, we are thinking of South Asia. So in that sense, there is more research, more scholarly work that is coming up. And what I find interesting is that there is a shift, therefore, in method of what we understand as an archive, and from the shift from, let's say, a certain kind of a looking at a print material to various other kinds of, one of the earliest method, even in attempting to write histories, was to go to the National Film Archive of India and look for the print journals to look at different, the kind of work that, let's say, Lotte has done, but also others, or I have looked into, let's say, biographies or letters or different kinds of material, posters, and there is so one is beginning to for quite a few years, actually, beginning to rethink what is the archive, what is it only the print material that is available in the sort of state archives, or how do we rethink? And also, in that sense, it is what is becoming far more interesting is the question of gender. And we and what I really find interesting is that that not only something that Elora was also mentioning, Rubaiyat's films, let's say, and of rethinking certain ideas which were almost considered sacrosanct. It is very important, not only for Bangladesh, but also from West Bengal, to have a kind of a reverence for Bangladesh Mukti Juddha, because it is about bhasha. So and it is so important, and then we begin to question these that, or let's say that Bangla cinema was seen as some kind of an alternative to popular Hindi cinema, and from the ones that were produced from West Bengal, like Satyajit Ray, and suddenly we are beginning to question that. So in there are oral forms, there are unreliable material that we are looking into, and we also women are the women's question is being looked into. But what I personally really find interesting is also more and more women scholars entering the field of film studies. There was once upon a time, and we were discussing this, last year in a conference organized by Lotte Debushree and others. So it is amazing to see that more and more, the film studies field has been as though taken over by women, and it is not only about their biological sex, as it were, but it is a particular kind of issues, subject, and concerns that become crucial, and this nation masculinity kind of or archive, kind of a stable archive that was imagined earlier has now become far more porous, and it's really interesting as in the ways we are able to think of both a larger horizontally, a larger framework, and as well as dig deeper into the both the material, what is the material history of cinema.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Madhuja, for that one, sort of encompassing comments, and on archives as well. And as we talk about archives, and we have to wrap up now, but as we talk about archives, I have to make the point that, Pakistani cinema, Pakistan doesn't have a national film archive. And in my work, as I've tried to work on small-scale women-led companies, film companies in Pakistan and connecting with other parts of South Asia, not so much India, in the 1980s, I have had to turn to oral histories, which is actually not my training to begin with. But without that, you cannot do justice, complete justice to Pakistani cinema, as I think Gwen and many others are going to agree. Looking at archives, recognizing archives as archives, memory as archive also becomes really important. And on that note, I have to thank, I'm going to, wonderful contributions to the book. You helped us imagine what transregional cinema is and can be. And in a South-South conversation, we hope to continue this conversation, maybe in future books. And it has been such a pleasure to be with all the contributors, all the our audience, wonderful questions. And thank you again for this opportunity to share our work with you. And over to Elora.
Well, I just want to echo Esha and thank you all. This has been so joyful, and for all of us to come together in this way. As you can see, we don't want to leave, but Zoom will cut us off in a couple of minutes. But I will say this, that we have recorded today's session and we will send you the YouTube video link when it is ready. And I too look forward to future conversations and continuing this conversation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Elora, I have a query. Oh, sorry. Raju bhai, please carry on. Okay.
Was there a question?
Yeah, we have 4 minutes. Okay.
Yes.
Raju?
No, I just wanted to add in, echoing voice, and a last note I would like to add on the scattered archive, that it's interesting that how you came up with South Asian filmscape in the title of the book, not say South Asian cinema. I think when you use filmscape, we immediately understand that film is much beyond than actual on-screen presence. So in other words, the popular cultural presence of cinema in so many various incarnations, and in especially in today's term, in intermedia, digital media, and all these. So probably we have to be more into these scattered archives more and more, because we want to not only look at, let's say, a national repository of cinema. We do want to, but what I also want to urge that we need to look beyond that, maybe on the street, let's say, And that is our scattered archive for South Asian cinema. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raju. So with that, I think we have to conclude for today. The recording will be available on YouTube very shortly. So this is going to be on YouTube.
Brilliant.
All right. Thank you all.
सहेली चुन ले अपना गुइया सबको हूँ मैं लाती ओए सबको हूँ मैं लाती सहेली चुन ले अपना साथी ओ गोरी चुन ले ओए चुन ले अपना साथी सहेली चुन ले अपना साथी তোমার করে নাও গো